welcome back to Vox Popcast, the weekly pseudo-academic roundtable of pop culture analysis with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am once again here with all of the co-hosts. Everybody's here. Wayne and Katya and Mav. How's it going, guys?
Huzzah.
Did we get a prize if we're all here?
It's been a while. It's been a few weeks since we've all been here. I'm not sure because we've had a few weeks where we were releasing shows that we recorded out of order, and things were weird and bizarre. And I don't know when today is, though. Hannah, you were just saying right before we recorded that this show is coming out on tax day. So that's interesting because it means now I have to go and finish my taxes, which I have not done yet. So
I can guarantee you that I am panicking in real time right now. Not as we record this, but
as the listener is listening to it, most likely.
Yes. I mean, Katya has watched me not do my taxes for like 7 years.
Yeah, it kind of stresses me out, to be honest. Not that I'm doing my taxes early, but
not do your taxes for that. I think you. I don't think you meant what that sounded like.
Don't release that.
No, I just want to. I mean,
she does her taxes. She just doesn't do them early. It's fine.
Yes,
it's fine.
Yes.
Everything is fine.
You did not just admit to a felony of 7 years on it.
While y'all are doing your civic duty because y'all are lazy, I, on the other hand, will be remodeling my Animal Crossing island because guys, I haven't played. I felt like I had to open it because there was back in March there was like the anniversary of the thing, and I hadn't logged in like 8 months because I love that Animal Crossing tells you that. And my villagers were angry at me, but now I have a sickness, guys. It's bad. It's really bad.
Not all of us have the privilege of playing Animal Crossing.
But there are Switches in stock. I think you can still get the Animal Crossing Edition one, which is very adorable. And if I didn't already have a Switch, I would probably buy it. And to be perfectly honest, I thought about it anyway, but I don't need 2 Switches because that's stupid.
But the question is, if I buy a Switch, will suddenly like a Switch Pro or something be released? And will I regret
sure,
it?
Of course it will, because that's how technology works.
Nintendo's less gross about that than other consoles that shall not be named, because I also love them, unless they're a particular one that starts with a consonant and ends with a box.
That seems like such a hard problem.
Someone is going to get cranky in the comments on YouTube. I guarantee you.
Oh, God. All right. So now that we've lost more of our audience every week, they
will continue because now they have to prove that they're right. Now they're going to come on as a guest and we're going to debate consoles.
They will grudge.
Seriously, actually, if somebody wants to debate consoles, because I have a lot of thoughts on this, because I think it's elitist bullshit. But
not it. Out for that episode. Not here.
Anyway.
Okay.
Anyway.
So fun topic. There's no transition from that because no. This should be an interesting topic. I hope, because just before we went on the air, we were talking just briefly about how today's show is on crossovers, and Katya said, well, we wanted to quibble with your definition of crossover. And I was like, I have no definition of crossover. I would quibble with many of the things that I said in the blog. I was just starting the conversation so we could have this show, because I was less hard on them than I thought I was going to be when I started the blog, because I think crossovers are kind of stupid and annoying and pointless in many, many ways. And not even clear on what a crossover is and isn't, other than the fact that how the more crossy ovary it is, the more I get annoyed sometimes. So that's kind of where the show started. So we're going to talk a lot about what is a crossover, why do they work, why do they do them, where are the origins. It's not just a comic book thing. It starts being popular in like TV shows right now, because like all TV shows are superhero TV shows now, but it didn't start there. So we got a bunch to talk about today. But before we do that, I brought a guest. So we're doing a crossover with another show, or several shows, because I want to introduce Sean Ross, who is the only person who's on more podcasts more regularly than I am. Hey, Sean, thanks for coming on.
How are you? Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Welcome,
Sean, you have particular expertise here, certainly in superhero realm.
Yeah, definitely. So I actually co-host a Marvel Superhero Secret Wars and Beyond podcast, which is just as cool as it sounds. And where we talk about every issue of every Marvel Superhero Secret Wars comic going back to 1984. So yeah, I'm a big crossover guy, and I'm excited that you brought me over to guest star in your book, because it's going to be a lot of fun.
So I'm going to insert here just because this is the best place for it, and then we can move on. I'm part of an ongoing old school Marvel Superheroes RPG.
Oh, that's awesome.
And playing an alternate universe version of the X-Men, all original characters. All the X-Men are dead in our universe. But we're kind of going chronologically, starting in the late 70s. And our next session, we've been snatched by the Beyonder for the Secret Wars.
That's amazing.
So that has nothing to do with this episode, other than this is the best place to talk
Wayne
about my
Wayne wanted the listeners to know how much of a nerd he is. So
yes,
that's it.
exactly.
let me tell you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I have to say, I am part of a 10-year face rip game, Marvel Superheroes game, where we played the genesis of the game is what if everybody stayed on Battleworld, and we picked up from there. So nice. I am right there with you.
Yeah, nice. We've been doing this about 3.5 years, so
that's amazing.
Okay. So now we have to start. And I'm not explaining what phase rip is. It's not the right acronym for a role playing game that TSR stopped making 30 years ago.
Yeah,
it's awesome, but it's just so we're going to be way outside. But I do want to explain what Secret Wars is, just because not only because it's Sean's show, but also because as far as talking about comic book crossovers, it's going to come up probably several times in this conversation.
Yeah.
So we think we should explain Secret Wars.
It's a good example for the overall topic.
And then we need to start getting into sort of the crux of the conversation, which is what does crossover even mean? So I'm going to start with Sean. If you don't mind, I'll let you do it, since you're more of an expert on that particular crossover than, well, anyone, because that's the entire point.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1984, Marvel did a crossover with a toy company. It was actually a toy promotion with Mattel, because DC and Hasbro were having real success with their Superpowers line of action figures, which are awesome. I love them to this day. Marvel saw that, said, hey, we can do that too. They went to Mattel. Mattel did a focus group with 12 to 14-year-old boys. They came back to Marvel, said, we'll let you figure everything out. But the boys liked the word secret and they liked the word wars. So go from there. And so editor in chief at the time, Jim Shooter, put together Marvel Secret Wars, in which this all powerful character named the Beyonder, who had never appeared before, kidnaps all of the heroes, your favorite heroes and your favorite villains from the Marvel universe, takes them to a place called Battleworld, gets them in all of these cool set pieces that, by the way, are never produced into toys, and dumps out his toy box, and everybody fights for 12 issues. And that's it. It is wildly successful. It sells on average of 800,000 to 1 million issues for each of the 12 issues of the Maxi series. It causes major repercussions across the Marvel universe. And the beauty of it is in its structure, because in issue 1, all the heroes and villains are taken away, and that happens in one issue of their own books. And then the next month they come back from the miniseries, they come back from Battleworld, and the change, whatever the change may be, has already happened, and you have to wait throughout the miniseries to see how. So best example might be when the Fantastic Four goes to Battleworld, the Thing is a member of the group. When they come back, She-Hulk has taken his place. So it was the second crossover in history. The first one wasn't quite as successful, but it's the first really big one. And it starts what I think people love and hate about crossovers and sort of crossover culture in comic books, where there's now just a big event a year, not always a crossover, but often big event a year, and event driven comics. And Secret Wars will always have a place in my heart. And it's one of the reasons all my dialogue ends in exclamation marks as well. But look, it was written for 10-year-olds. I was 10 years old when I read it. I also loved the word secret, and I loved the word war. And so, I'm a big fan. And I think it's definitely the archetypal crossover. I mean, if you ask, what is the platonic ideal of crossover? It is that. It is Secret Wars, because it's dumping out your toys onto the floor and having everybody fight everybody.
Yeah. And just as a footnote, Jim Shooter's from Pittsburgh originally, and he's 9.5 feet tall.
he inserts Iron City beer into many of his comics, and because of that, I tried Iron City beer, and I don't recommend it.
No, that's a shame. Yeah.
No, that was a mistake.
I don't recommend it.
Okay, so that was our part of the genesis was, what Secret Wars is, because it probably is the most well-known comic book crossover ever. Maybe Crisis, which is a DC comic around the same time. But crossovers aren't just that. And that's where so this is where I want to start talking about what is a crossover exactly, because in the blog, I was trying to come up with some earlier examples, and I didn't when I wrote the blog, I literally wrote it between grading 2 different papers, because that was my break. My break from work was to do more work. And just off the top of my head, I mentioned a couple of, before comic book things that I could just think of literally with the 30 seconds worth of thought that I gave it, which was Shakespeare, which crosses over Romeo and Juliet with Gentleman of Verona. And what was the other one I mentioned? Joseph Andrews. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Joseph Andrews and Pamela, which.
But we're going to. You go ahead and I'll tell you why I need to quibble.
Yes. But the premise of the book, Joseph Andrews, and they're written by 2 different people, Pamela, and which Hannah will explain in a moment. But the premise of the book, Joseph Andrews, is the protagonist of that book is presumptively the younger brother of the protagonist of this other book that had already been popular called Pamela. And the authors didn't like each other, but he was just like, well, I'm going to continue your story here. And that's why I called it a crossover. Is it a crossover? Is it a sequel? Is it just a mean dig at another author? Yes to all of that.
No. And also I think you collapsed in the blog. You said that Pamela and Joseph Andrews like existing together with serialization. And I also have to quibble with that too. I might have misinterpreted what you said.
I might have misspoke.
So there's a shared universe sort of with Pamela and Joseph Andrews, which I guess I'll just launch into the 18th century. Again, I'm not an expert, and actually, strangely, as Mav was writing this blog, my 18th century reading group just finished reading Tom Jones, which is another novel by Henry Fielding. Mm-hmm. And I actually don't delve this far back into the 18th century usually because, for instance, Joseph Andrews was published in 1742. I really, like the back half of the 18th century and the 19th century because I focused on Victorianism in grad school. So everything I know about Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding, I learned from my colleagues who actually study the 18th century more intensely than I do. Long story short, Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding, as Mav said, did not super like each other and were sort of literary rivals, and literary critics, it seems, have kind of like pitted their version of the novel against each other because they're considered 2 very early novelists, which I also have quibbles about, but that's another episode. So
it sounds a lot like my James and Wells beef problem.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So Samuel Richardson wrote Pamela, which we've talked about on the show before. And basically the story of Pamela is a very like chaste, good girl, servant girl who writes letters. It's an epistolary novel, goes to work for some dude named Mr. B. And he's an absolute massive dirtbag. And he falls in lust with her, tries to rape her, doesn't succeed for various reasons, and then realizes that her virtue is super good and important and decides to make her a real like proposal of marriage. And so the back half of the full title, Pamela, is virtue rewarded, and Pamela is rewarded by her virtue. And Fielding was like, this is garbage. And actually, like, Fielding wrote plays before he wrote novels and prose. And I'm going to just vulgarly say that Samuel Richardson made him so mad that he ended up writing, like, novels. So before he wrote Joseph Andrews, he actually wrote something called Shamala. And Shamala is, I guess the literary term would be parody. And the fandom 21st century term would be spitefic. He wrote this spite fic about how, like, Pamela, who is actually Shamala, is actually not a good girl. She's pretending and she's awful and, like he makes fun of everything Richardson does. And then he wrote Joseph Andrews, which is basically the premise of what Mav said, but it's still like a parody and like very different in the vein of what Richardson wanted. So they're not one work, which is why I quibble with serialization. They're not one work. They're sort of in a shared universe in the sense that like Fielding was inspired / super angry at Richardson. So like, think any like fandom who's ever been mad at the end of a TV show and decide to do like his own thing on, so like it's different for that reason. He's like, it's different in tone. And then also like, I also quibble with this because I'm also thinking about the 19th century and unauthorized sequels. Like later in the 19th century, George Eliot would write Daniel Deronda, and a lot of people were mad about characters not ending up together. So like a woman literally wrote an unauthorized sequel, but like that's not serialization. That's an unauthorized sequel. So I think they're separate works. No,
I think you're actually about to say the thing that I was about to say, but like I think it's the history, like what serialization actually means is actually pretty historically specific. Right. Of like it comes from, and Hannah, please jump in here because this is probably more your area than mine. But it basically comes from the fact that in like massive novels, often Victorian novels, like were often published in a triple decker format, which literally means 3 volume. I think Lord of the Rings is one story. Part of the reason you start having you have series in serial is because people have, stories that are long that you can put comfortably in one volume, otherwise they fall apart. And then the other thing is also, and this is where the origins of like a lot of young boys literature comes out in the 20s and 30s, especially in sort of science fiction, which is how I know of this. But it's also the way that novels and longer form narratives were published in periodicals. Yes, so it's basically the
periodicals more than even the triple decker novel.
Well, look, the Three Musketeers first appeared that way, and they
Tales of Cities, and
they appear. The Three Musketeers also appear in Man in the Iron Mask. So there's it's crossover.
Yeah, like so Dickens, I think, is the big example of like the history of serialization as like the par excellence format, and like he tended to publish 2 ways. Like how for contemporary people who don't care about the 19th century as much as we do, how like individual comics are sold in like individual volumes. Dickens would sometimes sell his novels like Little Dorrit in individual installments. Little Dorrit was published in 19 different installments. And actually, fun fact, Duke Library has some of these original installments. And I got to take my class to go see them. No one. And they had like ads in them, and it was really interesting to see like how this works.
So to use modern terminology, the chapbooks that they were just a chapter at a time. Yeah.
And then, as Katya said, periodicals. And so like something like Household Words had like A Tale of Two Cities. And what's interesting about periodicals is like you would see, a chapter or 2 of a Dickens novel alongside other authors, but there would also be prose texts. And it really just depended. And so like you can read these novels alongside other contemporary writers in that way in the periodical. So like it, there's different sort of varying degrees of serialization. I think we're going to do an episode on this soon and talk about it. But, if you also think about like the radio serial or the TV serial, and how there's different breaks, but it's one whole cohesive work, and what that means in modern times might be a little different, but that's sort of the origin.
And the reason I wanted to talk about serialization is because I think one of the examples Mav brought up in his post is a really good one to start thinking about what we mean when we say crossover, because I think in 2 different media formats, the story in one format, the story is a crossover, and the other one I don't think it is. And part of that is because of serialization. So Mav, I think in like the first couple paragraphs of your blog post, brought up Falcon and Winter Soldier, which I was thinking about a lot. Of like, is that a crossover? Is it technically a crossover? And I think it is probably in the comic book sense, because as I understand it, in the comic books, both Falcon and Winter Soldier have their own series. So so having them converge would be a crossover. But in the TV show, I don't think it is a crossover because it's part of a singular narrative, because it's basically part of the series that is Captain America. So I don't know if it's a crossover so much as a cameo.
I don't I don't think it's either. I think comics sort of, Sean, you were getting at this, like Secret Wars was a big special thing, right? Mm-hmm. We had crossovers before in comics, like going way back. Going way back to the 1950s. Oh my God, the Golden Age Flash met the Silver Age Flash. This is crazy. This is amazing. People would wait. And it's like, what does this even mean? People's minds exploded. Superman and Batman are in a story together. Yeah. And it was like no one had ever seen anything like this in the medium before. And then it became normal. It just became a thing where people team up sometimes and they're just team ups. Are they even crossovers? It doesn't matter, right? Because whatever's happening in Batman's book, if he shows up in Superman, you would never know. And it doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's normal. Secret Wars, as Sean pointed out, was special because Secret Wars had stakes to it. People might like or hate Secret Wars, and there's a lot of reasons to like or hate it because it is not a perfect comic in anyone's reckoning, I don't think. But it had stakes where, like Sean said, the Fantastic Four leave and they come back and they're a different team. Like Ben Grimm, founding member of the Fantastic Four, is gone with no explanation of where he is, and She-Hulk's there. Spider-Man leaves and he comes back in a completely different costume. Like there's all these weird. The X-Men leave. And Colossus comes back and he breaks up with Kitty Pryde immediately. And you don't know why. Like there are ramifications of it to where the story merged these separate worlds. But then so it was really, really special in 1986. Like that was a special moment. Now in 2021, that's just how comics work. And I don't know that they're special. Right. So like when you say Falcon and Winter Soldier are, you know, in the comics, they're both part of the Captain America story. Like they are much like in the movies, they're Cap's two best friends. And so they're around. And is it a crossover or is the story just told in branching chapters like the MCU is, right? Like the reason the MCU works is, there's a little bit of the story here with Iron Man. Now there's a little bit of the story with Captain America. Now there's a little bit of story with Ant-Man. And now we're going to bring it all together and you're going to see this all in Avengers. And then we're going to do that again. And we're going to do it in Avengers 2. Right. And then we bring in the Guardians of the Galaxy. And I don't know if those are crossovers or not. And I don't know if the term is meaningful anymore or not.
And I think comics have continually moved that direction as well. That's just the way, as you say, that's the way stories.
Can I be annoying? No. Well, when we say that it's possible, and I just thought of this now, so it probably means nothing. So Spider-Man is owned by a different studio, like the rest of Spider-Man movies are owned by a different studio than the rest of the MCU. Mm-hmm. Would we say that Spider-Man is actually sort of more of a crossover than the rest of the MCU when they meet for Avengers movies or Captain America Civil War, or when, some of the Avengers make cameos in the Spider-Man films, because that has some sort of business stakes to it, and it's not guaranteed that relationship will continue, as we saw when there was that dramatic moment when I had a meltdown about Spider-Man 3 and how the narrative would go.
I think for me it comes down to terminology, and this is very comic book universe, but I think it applies here. There's a difference between shared universe and crossover, and in my mind, the shared universe, and this is what makes Marvel very successful in the comic books. DC does this as well, but really nobody does it as well as Marvel. Is this idea that if Marvel is the world outside your window, and most of it is happening, for example, let's say in New York, then in a Marvel comic, Thor could fly by in the background in an issue of Spider-Man. Now, I would not call that a crossover because the event itself, the action and the stimulating events of the issue are not involving Thor. It's just this reminder that they occupy the same space. And so in my mind, there's a lot of shared universe in comic books. And it's part of the beauty of it because it creates this larger tapestry of the imagination where an event is the purposeful gathering of disparate characters for a common event or goal, like for a common inciting incident. And so in my mind, that's what separates the two. And
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in because I'm thinking of two titles that were popular back then, Marvel Team Up and Marvel 2-in-1, where every issue it was Spider-Man or the Thing teaming up with a different character. And each story was self-contained. I wouldn't call any of those crossovers. They were just a story in the Marvel universe that happened to involve these two characters. It could have happened in any book. But I wouldn't call that a crossover because it wasn't an event. It was the premise of the series.
Okay, so if we move to dovetail the two things Hannah has said, right? Because Hannah, by your question there about like Spider-Man, while the character is owned by Marvel, and I don't want to get too far into the business stuff. Probably most of our listeners understand it, but Spider-Man's owned by Marvel Comics, but the film rights are currently controlled by Sony Pictures. So there is a lot of behind the scenes machinations that have to occur in order to make Spider-Man show up in an MCU film. But he does standardly, right? So there's a business purpose. I would say that is not exactly the same, but similar to the way in which Pamela and Joseph are owned by two different authors, right? Like one is continuing it, but also. But there's an integrity of the character of Spider-Man and Peter Parker that is recognized by both shared universes. Right. Whereas Fielding and Richardson don't recognize each other other than to
I also feel like if we start like if like property ownership starts becoming part of the definition of the crossover, I feel like it becomes even less of a helpful term because like does that mean basically as soon as another owner acquires half of a property, it becomes a crossover? Like, put a pin in for that for a minute because I'm going to come back to that in a little bit because I actually have that question. But I guess what I'm saying is like from the perspective of the people consuming the narrative, I don't know that ownership makes sense. It might create implications of like whether or not it's easier to make a crossover or make certain stories. Outside of movie and comic geek world, like, you know, we're podcasters who follow this crap, right? But outside of us, I don't know that most regular people know how much of a kerfluffle there was with the Spider-Man might leave the MCU thing. Like I don't know that crosses over to. I have friends who don't understand why Superman didn't show up in Avengers because there's a lot of people who are on that level of awareness of what the movies are, which one's in which universe, and they don't really care so long as the movie's good. So I don't know how much the businessy Sony versus Marvel stuff mattered. But to the shared universe thing that Sean was just talking about, is that different? So I'm thinking there were points in reading comics in the 80s and 90s where love or hate Jim Shooter ran a really tight ship. You know, the trains ran on time, right? Is basically the best I could say about him. And if there were some event in Spider-Man that causes a blackout, then Daredevil comics, the lights just go out in Daredevil and Daredevil doesn't know why. And he just has to deal with it. He just has to deal with, there's a blackout in New York. Wonder what happened. I don't know, but I got to deal with it. And he never finds out. It's just that the lights are out. Right. So there's that kind of integrity to the universe that I also don't think is really a crossover, even though I sort of implied that it might be in the blog. I don't think that's really the same thing because it's more that everyone's playing in the same playground, right? It's not, like the events in one place might affect another place, but I don't know that it's
if there's a blackout in Pittsburgh, you and I aren't crossing over.
Right. Or just if we look at Riverdale, best show on television, right?
Riverdale, oh God, not that again. Why?
Riverdale exists in the same shared universe as Sabrina and Katie Keene and apparently Nancy Drew. Though you wouldn't be able to tell, but there are subtle hints that they exist in the same universe. Most of the characters have never met each other from any of those things. So like there are little hints to it where like sometimes somebody who might have been, a supporting character on one show might show up on another show. But I don't know that that's a crossover so much as just I have friends who happen to know Katya. Well, and if I hang out with one, we're not crossing over. It's just
I think there has to be some kind of like active part in the narrative because I think there's a difference between a crossover and a shared universe. Because there's all kinds of completely disjointed movies of like, this is actually in the shared universe of, Blade Runner and The Simpsons and just exists in the same universe because reasons. And like, which like, okay, cool. Let's assume for the, it's a stupid example, but let's assume for the sake of the argument that's true. Like, okay, like what ramifications does that have in any way on either movie?
None.
So I bring up Spider-Man versus the MCU as if they were different to bring up, the business model. And the reason why I'm doing that, because I'm now thinking about when companies or studios or authors call something a crossover. And so, for example, Shonda Rhimes' Grey's Anatomy universe has crossed over with the shows that are spin-offs. First Private Practice, then Station 9. I'm not a viewer, so sorry, Station 19.
It's 19.
19, yeah, Station 19. So, you can see how much
How to Get Away with Murder has been in there. His crossover. Those things cross over. The Simpsons and Futurama crossed over. I think you mentioned this in the blog now, but the most famous, perhaps, TV show crossovers are the CW superhero shows that cross over. Fox had Brooklyn Nine-Nine and New Girl crossover, and they called it a crossover. Although, I think from my memory of 4 years ago watching this, it was just Jake and Jess showed up in each other's episodes, and it didn't super affect things, and you didn't have to watch each show to understand. But it feels like a lot of these are it's an advertising model, it's a business model. Some of the storylines absolutely force you to watch the other movies, which is also true of some of the MCU. So it's a blurred definition. But I wonder how much crossover is meaningless, to go back to that point as a term, except when certain, creators, studios, what have you, want to advertise a crossover to make it a special event. To make more money.
I think it's a useful, because it's not a meaningless term in the term, it communicates a basic idea. And I think that's why it's really valuable for marketing. But I think what we for the listener, what I think we're saying when we say it's a meaningless term, it's not a good definition in the academic sense to identify a specific a specific concept, a specific form of the genre, if that makes sense.
Could it be though? Because I feel the more we're talking, the more I think that crossovers are rooted in a sense of place. That the key there is that, and I'm thinking Secret Wars is my jam, right? I'm thinking that while all of the characters involved in Secret Wars live in a shared universe, they actually occupy very different defined subsets of those universe, right? Daredevil is in Hell's Kitchen, and even though that's only 4 blocks, it's still his 4 blocks, whereas the Fantastic Four and the Baxter Building and Doctor Strange is elsewhere, and so I think for me, as we're talking about it, the thing that is kind of emerging is that what makes a crossover, and is even sort of implied in the name, is that there's a very clear definition of place, and that when these characters are crossing over, they are either crossing over into the space of another hero, and so the narrative is going to be shaped by that space. It's almost like you're taking one character and you're writing them in a different universe, but it's again shared universe, but it's still a different narrative sense and some different narrative structures. And I think the most successful crossovers have done this. You remove the sense of place from everybody. You clear the board and you put them somewhere neutral. You put them on Battle World, or you put them in the Crisis in DC, where all of the universes are colliding, all the spaces are intruding upon each other. So for me, I think the difference for me is it's that real rooting in a sense of place, and that the crossing over is the move to a new space for at least one of those characters. And I don't know if that works.
I think that there's something to that. I also, though, wonder if how much of this is specific to comic books, because when I think about what it would mean to have a crossover in, say, video games, for example, I don't know if it's quite, because to me, the idea of a crossover being something of different parts of New York would not work in a video game, for example.
I think there's a narrative definition too, though. I think you have the characters, whether they're already in a shared universe, but they're having individual stories. If they meet up and have a story together, but even there, that contradicts what I just said about Marvel Team Up. I don't think of that as a crossover, but that's definitely a space thing. You're putting these two characters in the same space. But if you get to TV shows or different companies putting this stuff together, there's a narrative reason for these characters to be together that allows you to create a story you couldn't tell unless they were together.
I think it's a combination of space and narrative. I think it has to be a piece of both.
It has to be both. Yeah. So let me present two different ones. One Hannah already mentioned, right? So I've watched the New Girl Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode, but I don't remember the plot of it anymore. I do remember the plot of the one that's on New Girl. So, on New Girl, the characters of New Girl meet two cops. They are cops from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. If you don't know that, it doesn't matter because, Andy Samberg's playing a cop on New Girl this episode. Okay, like you need to know nothing about Brooklyn Nine-Nine in order to watch that episode. You don't need to know that he has a life that exists beyond that half an hour. So that they called it a crossover. I remember when it aired and they called it a crossover, but I don't know that it mattered in the sense that anything that happens in the context of that New Girl episode does not affect Brooklyn Nine-Nine at all. So yes. That's only nebulously a crossover. It's a crossover in the business sense. But then there's the example that I left in the blog, which is because I was specifically trying to go outside of the comic book universe because it happens so frequently, especially in superhero comics. So I used the Magnum PI Murder She Wrote crossover, which is interesting because when I was writing the blog up, my wife, who is a massive Murder She Wrote fan, right? She has no recollection of this whatsoever because they often don't include it when they're syndicating Murder She Wrote. Because she looked at it and she's like, "Oh, that's funny. You put you photoshopped together a picture of Magnum PI and Murder She Wrote." And it's like, no. That's a still from the episode. And she's like, what episode? Because she doesn't remember it happening, right? Mm-hmm. There is an episode of Murder. So Murder, She Wrote and Magnum PI, there was never any recognition that they were in the same universe up until 1 week during like season 4 of Murder, She Wrote and season 9 of Magnum PI, right? Magnum gets arrested for murder at the beginning of an episode. His show's on like Mondays and Murder, She Wrote's on like Thursday or something like that. So on Monday's episode of Magnum PI, he gets arrested and he needs help. He gets arrested for murder that he doesn't commit and he needs help. So he uses his one phone call to call his friend Jessica that turns out to be Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote. And he has her fly out to Hawaii, removing her into a different space as because Murder, She Wrote happens in Maine and Magnum PI happens in Hawaii. Yeah. Cabot Cove, murder capital of the world.
Exactly.
Jessica Fletcher's doing all those murders and Steph's not on this episode, so she can't stop me from saying that. But he calls up Jessica Fletcher. She flies out to Hawaii and she helps him, and she doesn't, by the end of the episode, she hasn't solved the murder yet. So you finish up Magnum PI.
So tune in Thursday for Murder, She Wrote.
And you have to tune in on Thursday to see how Magnum and Jessica solve the rest of this murder. And so it really is a combination of those two shows. So much so that, like I said, when they syndicate them, they often just remove those 2 episodes from the run because it doesn't make sense. But if you buy the DVD box sets, the DVD box set of that season of Magnum has a random episode of Murder, She Wrote on it.
Okay,
and the DVD set,
that was going to be my next question because that's one of the things.
Otherwise, it makes no sense. Yeah, it's unwatchable.
And I'm going to jump back to comics for a moment because that whole thing of when you get the company-wide crossover, the big event kind of thing, there's usually the core series, Secret Wars, whatever. Then there are all these other pieces. There are the times when the main narrative, like a major plot effect, something that affects the plot deeply, appears someplace other than the main narrative. And the example I'm going to use is Blackest Night from, 15 years ago, whenever Blackest Night came out, Green Lantern. And Blackest Night was an 8-issue miniseries, but it crossed over into like 4 other Green Lantern titles. And if you
a couple of Supermans.
Yeah, right. But if you just sit down with Blackest Night as a graphic novel and want to read that story, between issue 4 and 5, there is a chapter that takes place in Green Lantern, not Blackest Night, that has huge ramifications. That's not included in the graphic novel of the main narrative. So you skip from issue 4 to 5 and it's incomprehensible. You now have to go buy another graphic novel for this one to make any sense. So that's problematic.
So my question then becomes, does a crossover have to necessarily, because this goes back to Katya's thing about, like, say, if Link shows up in Mario versus Smash Brothers, right? Does a crossover have to be, I don't know how to say this other than like consequential to the narrative?
Yeah. And for context, so this was a conversation we were having before the episode. So for context, I am not an expert on the Nintendo universe, despite having played way too much Animal Crossing for my own good. And Super Smash Brothers actually. But Super Smash Brothers has a narrative to it. There's a narrative continuity between the different, Smash Brothers titles. And it is basically all the characters from all the things. It's like a giant, it's like Ready Player. It's Ready Player One, but you can play it and it's not misogynistic and annoying in the way that the actual one is. Anyway, like I said, I'm not an expert on Nintendo lore, but Smash Brothers happens in the Nintendo universe. And the Nintendo universe is somewhat contiguous between different titles, but they they sort of intersect sometimes. I would say more in a cameo way than a true crossover way. But like Smash Brothers, like the events of Smash Brothers, for example, like don't really affect the Legend of Zelda series in a substantive way. There's some like abstract lore connections that happen between games that a lot of people have articulated. Whether or not they're canon, I can't speak to that. But so I don't know what to classify Smash Brothers as. It's just like a giant. It's just like a giant cameo fest. It's not a crossover really either. But it's just
except that it's exactly Secret Wars.
Yeah, so I think it is.
That's where I'm because it doesn't matter. It's not Secret Wars in that the events of Super Smash Brothers do not matter outside of Super Smash Brothers, right? Like Link shows up and he never mentions it in the Zelda books, or
at least not significantly.
Not significantly. Mario doesn't care in his world. Mega Man doesn't care in his world. So it's not significant. But on the other hand, it's exactly taking all of your Nintendo toys and dumping them onto the floor and saying, "Oh my God, I can make Mega Man punch Wario." That's the game, right? Like that's the whole game. Is just what happens if Link and Yoshi get to fight each other.
But it's part of that though, because I mean, okay, having not read that particular comic book and not being one of the comic book people on the call. Smash Brothers, I think part of what's so difficult to define is because we've already talked about is like it seems to be in order to have a crossover, there has to be some sort of like narrative convergence. Super Smash Brothers has a story and it's basically like a big bad evil has emerged. We must all defeat the big bad evil collectively by punching each other because reasons.
That's the plot of Secret Wars.
Yeah, that's it.
Because I guess part of the thing that doesn't make Smash Brothers a compelling crossover to me is because narratively, like the narrative's an excuse to have a brawl. It's not a major part. Like it's not a narrative video game, and in the way that I would assume for a comic book, it's a story, so there has to be some kind of narrative. Like Super Smash Brothers.
You're still describing Secret Wars.
Yeah, right, then I have nothing.
It's arguably bad.
Because Super Smash Brothers doesn't need a story because it's just a game and you like to punch your friends in a way that's not domestic violence. Whereas I mean, comic book has to have words and pictures and plot, doesn't it? What is this thing?
I think
ideally it should.
The ramifications of Secret Wars, i.e. the new costume, She-Hulk and Fantastic Four, were far more important than any of the individual events in Secret Wars itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's actually kind of what we're talking about is I think Super Smash Brothers is the perfect example of a crossover. Where we're getting a little hung up is whether it's good or not. And I think you used the word compelling. Like there are crossovers. This is really in the weeds, but the Secret Wars, there's been 3 volumes of Secret Wars miniseries over the course of 30 years at Marvel. And the third one is excellent because it's really rooted in narrative. It's a Doctor Doom story at the end of the day. And
there's
that's
a plot to the third one.
Yeah, the third one has a beautiful story, beautiful art, characterization. It has real impact. So it's a good crossover, but it's no less a crossover than Secret Wars 1, which is literally Super Smash Brothers in the Marvel Universe. So I do think they are crossovers. And I think Super Smash Brothers is probably the best example of one, but it just isn't necessarily compelling if your interest is the overall narrative of the Nintendoverse. Okay. If my interest is fun game, then Super Smash Brothers is great.
But I guess that's why I struggle with calling it a crossover, because crossover implies exchange. So it implies that what happens in the Super Smash Brothers universe is consequential for the other universes, which is not true. Okay. So there's input from the Zelda universe, the Mario universe, etc. There's not really equal exchange going backwards. I think that's why I hesitate to call it a crossover.
That's an interesting. I think and that maybe because that probably is the difference, right? Like the difference between Super Smash Brothers and Secret Wars is, again, Super Smash Brothers, nothing matters, right? But I
wouldn't say nothing matters. Like I said, that there are nebulous universe implications.
Nothing significant. Is that better?
A direct, it is not like there's not a Zelda game that directly references the events of
right.
And I'm not aware of any other Nintendo game that does. I could be wrong about that, but
okay. So in the comics thing, the Marvel DC cross company crossover, JLA Avengers, Superman,
right,
Spider-Man, X-Men, Teen Titans. They're that. I mean, they are. You're taking these characters from different companies. You're putting them in the same place. There's a narrative reason for them to be together. They made some really good stories out of that. None of them are ever mentioned again, nor will they be. They have no impact whatsoever on when they go back.
So what
they essentially don't happen in the JLA Avengers crossover. Does not happen in either the Marvel or the DC universe. It happens in that one book. Period.
Interesting.
And never referenced anywhere else.
Okay.
So what about Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Yes.
So that's kind of that similar thing. I just want to reference Wreck-It Ralph once because
Perfect.
No, that's perfect. Yeah.
Because there are cameos different actual video game characters in that, right? Like Bowser shows up in a villain support group or something. But those characters literally cross over at the end of the night when the video games come off, right? It's like a behind the scenes crossover because there are implications for every game depending on what the characters do. And when Ralph leaves his video game to not be a villain, it really screws it up for the Mario character whose name I can't remember because he thinks it'd be
what color is the outfit?
No, he's a character that is basically Mario for Wreck-It Ralph. He's Fix It Felix.
Oh, okay.
He's Fix It Felix, yeah.
I surprisingly haven't seen Wreck-It Ralph, which seems like a massive oversight on my part.
I
I
recommend Wreck-It Ralph 1. Yeah. I think Wreck-It Ralph 2 is basically Toy Story 4 and Frozen 2, and Disney needs to stop doing the same story over again. But that's another story for another day. Anyway.
Wreck-It Ralph 1 is whimsical and you'd love it.
I like whimsy. I like whimsy in video games. These are the two things that I enjoy.
I also want to be annoying and throw in another term and ask.
We're never annoying on this show. Excuse me.
Yeah. Is there a difference between mashup and crossover? Because that's
the word. That's what I would call Super Smash Brothers. That is a brilliant.
Yeah. In doing a very careful research for this episode, I of course went on the Wikipedia page of crossover and found there were shows that were mentioned, and one of them was Once Upon a Time, which for those of you who have not watched this show that was interesting at first, then became the hottest of messes.
That is fair. That is entirely fair.
So basically the premise is Snow White and Prince Charming live happily ever after and have a daughter, and the Wicked Queen's not happening, no happy endings for you. So the daughter gets separated, grows up in our world, and is bitter because she's alone in the world. Yes. And then she ends up in this small town in Maine because of reasons that I won't get into because they get too long. But she this small town in Maine, I think it's Maine. It doesn't matter. Anyway, Storybrooke. Anyway, she's in Storybrooke, and then she is being convinced that it's actually full of fairy tale characters who can't remember their past lives, including her mother and father, and she has to save them, and it devolves from there and includes all sorts of fairy tales and also eventually Disney specific versions of characters like Elsa and Anna. Very strange sequel to Frozen that honestly I think was better than what Frozen 2 came up with in hindsight, but whatever, that's not the point of this. Anyway, point is it's a shared universe that has a lot, draws on a lot of sources and brings things together in a coherent narrative, and it's used as an example of crossover. But it doesn't feel like a crossover to me because it's not.
It's a new thing.
It's a new thing.
And in comics there was Fables, which was much the same premise.
Yeah.
I think actually people say that Fables inspired Once Upon a Time and may have been some.
Yeah.
But we won't get
Having seen both, I could see that argument. On the other hand, it's also just a very obvious thing to do, right?
Yeah,
there was a sitcom way back that I'm forgetting the title of right now. The Charmings, yes.
Yeah. That I might be the only two people on the planet who remember the Charmings.
Well, the Charmings had the best convention ever, which is that in many ways, it's exactly the same as Once Upon a Time. It's Snow White and Prince Charming trying to live their happily ever after. Only unlike some versions of where there's the Charming brothers like in Into the Woods. No, Prince Charming from Cinderella and Prince Charming from Snow White is just the same guy.
Yeah.
So Cinderella is his ex. And Snow hates her.
Yeah,
Snow White
I forgot
hates
about
her.
that.
It's so great.
That's the Prince Charming in Fables as well. Well, the term mashup to me implies something very different than that, though. To me, mashup is taking two things and creating something new out of it. So in music, you can go on YouTube and look up mashups where somebody at home with iTunes,
DJ Danger Mouse, the great album with
where you take two different songs, Love Will Tear Us Apart and Love Will Keep Us Together, and mash them up into one song. You know, where you actually mesh the music and the lyrics from these two different songs to create a new entity. In comics, I'm going to use the example of the Amalgam Comics, where Marvel and DC did a whole series of characters like Super Soldier, who was Superman and Captain America if he was the same guy. And
makes perfect sense.
Yeah, you know, and they were original characters, but they embody characteristics from a character from Marvel and a character from DC. So I think of that as a mashup. Here's a brand new character, but it only exists as a amalgamation of these two other existing characters. But I don't see that as a crossover in the same way either.
I agree. Can I ask, does the way the narrative is constructed over time impact it? Because, and this is going to sound really weird, but I was thinking about, so the Justice Society of America, which was the first ever superhero team back in the 40s, they were actually a collection of characters from different companies who were put together on one team to try to sell more comics. But the conceit was the Justice Society Golden Age books would open with the Justice Society members like Hawkman and the Atom and Sandman sitting around a table, and then they would go off on an adventure, and it would be solo stories with those characters in their own sort of company worlds. And in my mind, that's always been a sort of pastiche of the Knights of the Round Table, right? Like it's, you know, same idea of like this shared mythology.
That first cover references that exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think about, if we're talking about crossovers, and if crossovers are the coming together of, and I'm not saying we've gotten to this place, but if it's potentially the coming together of disparate universes or characters into sort of one narrative convention, then do texts that develop through like oral language and tradition count? Like would the Judeo-Christian Bible count? Would the Iliad count?
I was going to mention earlier, and this is the perfect place for it, the Arthurian tales. The stuff we think of as Arthurian legend came from a wide variety of sources. The Tristan and Isolde stories were their own set of tales that had nothing to do with King Arthur until a couple hundred years later, where they were blended into it. And you know, we still get 1 million different people every year writing their take on the Arthurian stuff. And it's
Green Knight. Sorry.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but exactly. So you know, these aren't really crossovers; they're new iterations of the tale. But if you
would call those mashups, Wayne? Or
yeah, I think so. Because plugging myself here, I wrote my Arthurian novel Bedivere. I thought you meant the other Arthurian novel, King of Summer. No, the one that is an actual Arthurian novel as opposed to, you know, symbolically an Arthurian novel. But Bedivere is, I mean, it's my take on those characters is sort of the culmination of every other Arthurian story I've ever read and how I view those characters and how I filter that information through my own whatever. So yes, I suppose my version of King Arthur is a mashup of every other King Arthur I've ever read, but not specifically. I am taking the one from Park Godwin and the one from Hal Foster and making them into one guy. You know?
So I want to segue into based on what you're just saying there, I want to segue into some of our listener comments. We had a question from a friend of the show, David White. He asked me specifically if I'd considered the Wold Newton stuff and the work of Win Scott Eckert. And I hadn't, but he's got a really interesting point there. So just because this goes into the shared universes versus serialization versus blah, blah, blah sequels. So Wold Newton universe is the Wold Newton family was originally designed by this science fiction writer named Philip Jose Farmer. And he comes up with the idea that the by then public domain books of Tarzan, Doc Savage, Sherlock Holmes, and Phineas Fogg, who's around the world in 80 days. Those are he says they all happen in the same universe. And what his rationalization is that on December 13th, 1795, this meteorite crashes into a cottage in Wold Newton. It's a city in England. That happened in real life. In our real world, that happened. This meteorite crashes into this town in England. And his argument is the meteorite was mildly radioactive and two carriages happened to be passing by as the meteorite crashed. And the inhabitants of those two carriages were irradiated and their offspring have the potential for greater intelligence and strength. And if you fast forward 100 years, those Tarzan, Doc Savage, Sherlock Holmes, and Phineas Fogg all happen to be descendants of people who were in those carriages. And so Farmer uses that to sort of weave together this universe of books. Now he's doing a mashup, right? He's just deciding, like Wayne mentions, that he's deciding that these stories are all glued together in order to do something new.
League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Planetary,
or Penny Dreadful.
Yeah, or Penny Dreadful.
They're all Penny Dreadful and Planetary are both Planetary, a comic book, Penny Dreadful, a TV show, both plays on the Wool Newton universe. They both owe something to it. Other people have built, besides Farmer's dead. Other people have built onto this universe, including Win Scott Eckert, who writes books today. Now, Eckert has this other concept that he calls outside of the. Now, he says that there's a Wool Newton universe, which very much is all about who can I tie back to this meteor event. Like the stories have to have that have that role. But he has this theory that he has these 2 volumes called Crossovers 1 and 2, and some friend of his whose name escapes me right now has also written Crossovers 3 and 4, which I had not gotten yet. But I went through Crossovers 1 and 2, A Secret Chronology of the World by Win Scott Eckert. What he has done is he has gone back through the history of literature and any 2 books that he can find that have what he would consider a legitimate crossover, where 2 characters from disparate narratives join together for one story. He considers them to have entered the crossover universe. He has special rules which sort of discount a lot of superheroes because like we said at the beginning of this episode, that just happens too often for Superman and Batman, and he doesn't want to say, if I include Batman, I include all the DC universe. So he doesn't just count superhero stuff. But anytime you see Sherlock Holmes fight Dracula, that means that Sherlock Holmes and Dracula both exist in this crossover universe. So he has thus traced the chronology of the crossover universe in 2 volumes from the dawn of time through the future. So the first volume goes from thousands BC with stories about Beowulf and Gilgamesh all the way. So
basically, in this person's universe, essentially almost every historic fictional character ever exists in the same universe.
No, it is. I mean, I've been going through this the last few days. He has very tight chronology rules because his project it's very much an academic project, right?
There has to be a reference to these characters needed.
There has to be a reference, and it has to make sense. So he is trying to build a cohesive timeline which includes both Sherlock Holmes and Phineas Fogg and who else? Frankenstein.
Okay.
It is very, very specific, and he only includes things when there's a cohesive story that is not incidental, the thing that we talked about earlier, right? So it has to be part of the narrative that this story only exists because Frankenstein and Dracula met each other, right? Or Dracula can live forever because he's a vampire, but Sherlock Holmes can't. So he's got to figure out a way how can Sherlock Holmes and Batman inhabit the same universe.
Gotcha.
And he does this chronology. It's fascinating. I don't know if it's useful, but it's fascinating. And that's kind of where I'm thinking is the idea of a crossover only an academic exercise, a thought experiment, to go back to our previous exercise, where we're just really trying to not even prove anything, but exercise our brains and say, isn't it neat that we can, we like pointing at stuff, as we've talked about lots of things. Do we only want the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to show up in Avengers movies because we can say, look, we can recognize the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Do we want Sherlock Holmes to show up in a Frankenstein story just because we want to do the academic exercise of what's it like if Sherlock Holmes has to solve Frankenstein?
I mean, probably. Crossovers are fun.
Yeah.
Or even if it's not a crossover, technically, all of these stuffs, mashups, crossovers, all this kind of stuff, it's fun because we like the characters we like. We like to see them in multiple contexts.
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line for all of our talk on the academics of this and what the definitions are. I think they continue to be successful and popular. People want to see them because it's fun. As you said, I think that's kind of the bottom line of why this happens. There's the what if element. What if Frankenstein met Donald Duck, or whatever.
I mean, like, look, like there were tons of 90s like small crossovers, like Ursula from Mad About You appeared on Friends because the same actress played Phoebe and Ursula. And then there was like Fran Drescher played Bobby Fleckman in Spinal Tap, and that's how I got Josh to agree to watch The Nanny to see the episode where she crossed over. Like it's
so it gets you. I mean, if it's good in that it gets your significant other to watch some TV show that you want to watch just to see that cameo. I mean, that's useful.
I mean, it's funny if you watch both shows. It doesn't affect the narrative if you haven't. Like, I've never seen an episode of Mad About You. I just know the fact. But it's like an extra thing for people who like I would have been upset if Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. had appeared in the background at some point in like an Avengers movie, because like random S.H.I.E.L.D. agents appear in those movies all the time. And they also cross over with that show. Like minor characters from the movies appear as minor-ish characters.
Yeah. So that goes back to our shared universe thing. Like how essential is it? So for your Mad About You example, because I actually did watch both shows, right? Ursula and Phoebe are sisters in the context of Friends and Mad About You. This matters a lot on Friends. Ursula shows up on Friends, and it matters that she is Phoebe's sister. That character, has ramifications that affect the narrative of Friends. You would never know on Mad About You. Phoebe doesn't matter to their universe at all, because Ursula on Mad About You is a minor character. She's a supporting character. And it doesn't matter that she has a sister. It just doesn't. Like, she is the same character, but you find out way more about their relationship. Ursula is far more important to the Friends plot than Phoebe is to the Mad About You plot, where she is inconsequential. You would never know.
I think the shared space thing matters too, because I think about you're talking about Friends. I remember when the ER doctors, when George Clooney and Noah Wyle crossed over onto Friends, and they were so out of place because ER was this hyper dramatic show, about life and death, and then they crossed over to Friends and flirted with Jennifer Aniston and Courtney Cox, and it just didn't really work, and it wasn't a successful crossover, because like you said, the stakes sort of weren't there. But I mean, I guess it meets the definition of a crossover. But when those stakes are present, or when there is a shared space, like I think about Frasier, when Woody came to visit Frasier in Seattle. That's one of my favorite episodes of that show. I think it's hilarious. And it's this reminder of this shared backstory, this shared universe that Frasier had sort of left behind from Cheers. And Woody just slides right in because the characters have this dynamic and this sense of shared place. And the audience has that same sense. So there's this sort of shorthand that's created that's really comfortable. And so, I think they're both crossovers, but I think it is the nuance between a good one and a bad one, or an effective one and an ineffective one, I should say.
So before we finish up, I just wanted to, just because we're talking about TV, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my favorite thing about crossovers, which is the Tommy Westphal universe, which I did not mention in the blog because I was like sort of saving it, and I don't know where to go with it. But I don't know if I wonder how much of a crossover there is with our audience. I was a big fan of the TV show St. Elsewhere. St. Elsewhere is a hospital drama, much like ER or Grey's Anatomy. It is it's a hospital drama that, among other people in supporting roles, stars a young Howie Mandel and a young Denzel Washington. Earlier in their careers, and it runs for 6 years from 1982 to 1988, and it takes place in a Chicago hospital. And there's a minor character in the TV show named Tommy Westphal, played by actor Chad Allen. And Tommy Westphal is the nephew of, I believe he's the nephew or the son of one of the doctors there. And he's autistic. He's just the autistic boy that is on a dozen episodes of this series that runs for 6 years. He's not important. He's not a major character. He's, coloring of the world is I happen to have an autistic child. And then the way St. Elsewhere ends is on the very final episode, as the show is ending, it's snowing outside, and the camera pulls back and it pulls back and it pulls back. And suddenly you see that the hospital is inside of this snow globe. And then you find out that Tommy Westphal is playing with the snow globe. And the entire series of St. Elsewhere had been a one-day daydream of Tommy Westphal, this autistic child. And everything that happened in the entire series was just something that he imagined one day. You also find out that Tommy's father is a character from the show, his father from the show, but also his grandfather is a completely separate, unrelated character from the show. So he apparently, and they're like a construction worker and a cook or a taxi driver or something. Like he imagined these whole different lives for everybody that he imagined all in one day. Now, the problem with this is St. Elsewhere was a very popular show at the time, and it crossed over with many other television shows, which have crossed over with other television shows, which have crossed over with other television shows and movies. And you can find people charting this online too. If you follow every possible crossover link, the way that Eckert does with novels, and you do it with television, some 80 or 90% of American television theoretically crosses over with St. Elsewhere within 5 or 6 links. And therefore, all of television happens in the mind of Tommy Westphal. So goes the argument.
I mean, I kind of enjoy that headcanon. So
yeah. Everything. And it gets weird, right? Because it ends up eventually crossing over, like the St. Elsewhere characters show up in Cheers, but also they show up in Scrubs, which wasn't even on the air at the time. And then stuff will cross over with eventually the X-Files. And then once you get to John Munch, who shows up in a crossover from Law and Order SVU, John Munch, played by Richard Belzer, has been on something like 15 or 20 different television shows as the same character. So you get, and then it kind of branches off into Blade Runner and Alien, and you get all these movies because it is absolutely bizarre. And I will hopefully link in the show notes if I remember. I will link in an image of or a link to the Tommy Westphal universe wikis that you can find and websites. It's fascinating, but again, does this matter? Because people will argue. I've seen people arguing, academics arguing about whether or not this makes sense. No, just because it crosses over, even if St. Elsewhere was a dream, it doesn't matter. If I dream about the president, doesn't mean the president doesn't exist. It just means that I had a dream where the president was in it, right? Joe Biden is still a real person, so it doesn't make sense, right? So I've seen people like argue this out, and it doesn't matter at all. It's an entirely academic exercise. So is that what crossovers are, right? Do we just enjoy it because we enjoy linking stuff? We enjoy counting and pointing.
I mean,
we like finding the pattern.
Like, not to get psychological about it, but like that's one of the things that our brains like to do is like we like making. I mean, when we say it's like it's purely academic argument, like that doesn't mean it's like that's why we like making the argument, is because like that's why the show exists, is because arguing is fun, it turns out.
Yeah, we're all academics, so
Yeah.
so sure.
And we're all pattern makers and pattern recognizers and puzzle makers. Putting the pieces together.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Like that's I think that's what the appeal of crossovers in some ways is. Like, not necessarily that it's an academic argument, because like, oh boy, that's exhausting. But like, yeah, we like seeing reoccurring characters. It's like, if you have a favorite character, you always want to see more of it, right? To a certain extent. I mean, I accept that Firefly it had its time, and probably if it kept going would have become horrible. But like, we like more content from our favorite characters and our favorite creators, and it's like. Mm-hmm. And we also like the nebulous exercise. Like, there's no reason like going on a fan wiki and writing fan articles should be as fun as it is. Like, for many people, like it doesn't make sense at all. But we enjoy it because it's fun. Because it's fun to like think. It's to me like part of the extended enjoyment. I mean, this is the reason why I like watching, even though it's kind of a weird thing. Like, I like watching, let's play videos of like video games. Why? Because it's just, I like those games, and it's a different way to consume that kind of content. I don't know where I was going with this, other than fun stuff is fun, and we should just enjoy fun stuff.
So we resolve nothing other than fun stuff is fun.
I think that's a resolution worth.
Fun stuff is fun. Eugenics bad.
Fun stuff is fun. Eugenics bad. I think we can agree. These are things we can agree upon, regardless of whether or not we can agree what a crossover is.
I think it's also the reason we have birthday parties. Not the eugenics part, obviously. Hopefully, it's the same reason.
It's the reason eugenicists have birthday parties, probably.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not judging, but I'm judging. I am judging.
Yeah,
We're judging.
We judge eugenicists on this podcast.
Yeah, but it's the same reason we have birthday parties, right? It's we get our work friends and our school friends and our family friends and our so we get all of our shared continuity together.
Yeah.
And we like to look at the tapestry and we like to bring everybody together and see what connections are made. And so, yeah, it's fun.
The idea that holiday parties are part of a shared universe makes
that's
it
right.
much easier.
We resolved something, Sean. You just gave us the answer. It's like a birthday party. That's exactly what it is. That's what cross.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. Right. Like if I have a party, which, like right now, big pandemic, we're waiting for people to be able to gather together. And what do you do for a birthday party? You exactly do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I have a birthday party, I invite 20 to 100 or, however your party is, but I invite 20 people over whose only real relationship is that they all know me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
sometimes, and sometimes we make other friendships and relationships through that party. I mean, I've had that happen at your parties.
Sure.
Yeah,
but that's the
you're
Are we
logic.
saying that friendship is the ultimate crossover? Are we going to do a cheesy Saturday afternoon cartoon special? I hate myself a little bit now. I'm sorry.
Well, we did cross over with Sean, so and Sean got to this episode through crossing over on my other show. So, I mean, that's how it works, right? There's the shared podcast universe.
Exactly. I also live in a snow globe, so it's good.
Sean, where can people find you?
So that's a great segue. So I am the co-host of Marvel Superhero Secret Wars and Beyond on the Pulp to Pixel podcast network, where we talk about Secret Wars. It's a lot of fun. I also co-host the Never Ending Reading Pile, where Buddy and I just pick random comics and talk about things that we love. It's a super positive show. It's just mainlining nostalgia. And then I co-host the Bat Pod, where we talk about the new Batman books as they come out. So, this is the point my life has brought me to, and I'm happy. It's a little weird to say it out loud, but it's good. It also feels good. So so thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun, and
thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. And I, as a English major and somebody who was an English teacher for 20 years, it was nice to exercise this part of my brain. So I appreciate it.
We need to talk about Marvel role playing sometime.
Yes. Yeah, I'm in.
We somehow haven't had a role playing episode yet, have we?
No.
Well, we had a D&D episode, but that's not quite the same.
Well, I was gonna say you and Wayne literally did a whole D&D episode. How is that not a role playing?
That's not the same.
But that's not role playing in general. That's D&D anyway. Okay. This is not important.
Yes. Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. I see. Palindrome Hannah, where can people find you?
You can find me at foxpopcast.com, where we post blogs and other content. Maybe you can be on the show if you have something to say about an upcoming topic.
And Katya.
You can find me on Instagram at justthatnerdkid when I decide to post, which is currently never, it seems.
You had a blast of several for a little bit there.
Yeah, I tried. It's maybe I'll just start posting my Animal Crossing creations, because that's my life now.
There you go.
Wayne.
Mostly here. Hey, I want to. A friend of mine gave what I thought was a great review for the show. I'm going to quote it here. He swears he's going to actually leave this in a review someplace, but I like this. He said that every time he listens to the show, he comes away from it feeling smarter. So mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished, dude.
Yeah. So
hold on. No, smarter because he's learned something from us, or smarter because he's comparing himself to us.
I
think because either, to be honest.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, I think he meant it in the positive way, that he actually learned something by listening to us. So.
I mean, if he leaves a 5-star review, do what you will, dude.
Maybe smarter because he understands what we're talking about. So it might be both.
Speaking of, I will read our new 5-star review that we got. Yeah. We have a review from Steve Schaefer that says, home of the 5-star review.
Yes.
This is a great podcast for anyone that wants to engage with the world around us in a more thoughtful way. Every week, the host and occasionally guests pick a topic, typically related to popular culture, and do an academic deep dive into it, teasing the topic apart and occasionally deriving greater understanding because of it. It was always entertaining, enlightening, and thought-provoking. And now with 31 5-star ratings out of a total of 32 ratings, I think it's fair to say that the Vox Popcast is truly the home of the 5-star review, which is what we want every episode, every podcast review to say.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. So if you would like to join Steve in having your review read on the air and just make us as delightfully happy as Steve just did, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify, but especially iTunes, because that helps people find the show. And now I'm plugging the show and I forgot to plug myself. So now, but I'm going to be really lazy and not edit it back in. So I don't know. You're listening still, so you figure it out. But you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, all the places, always at Chris Maverick. You can follow the show, all those same places, at Vox Popcast. You can also follow the show on YouTube. We'd really appreciate it if you like and subscribe and hit bells and smash bells. I don't know YouTube stuff. I'm old.
Like, subscribe, and ring the bell, my friends.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As I said, you can subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever the hell else you get podcasts from. Leave us that 5-star review. Make us happy. Goose's algorithms makes the show happy and special. And I don't know, crossovers will happen. And every time you leave a 5-star review, an angel gets its wings. You know, good stuff like that. I would like to thank Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out. I'd like to thank Sean for joining us. I'd like to thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.